The year was 1969, and the United States was about to answer the challenge laid down by President Kennedy in September of 1962.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
In this week's episode of Everything Under the Sun, we take a small step back to July 20th, 1969, and revisit Apollo 11's historic trip to the moon.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Rocket Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to land. We're landing again. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind.
Welcome to this week's AccuWeather podcast, Everything Under the Sun. I'm your host, Regina Miller, along with my producer, Andy Robb, and AccuWeather Director of Audio Services, Ken Prell. And this week is all about the moon landing, guys. We're going to be talking about the timeline of events, the technology that it took not only to launch humans into space, but also to guarantee their survival in such a hostile environment. You guys weren't alive at the time.
No, not at the time. Not at the time.
No.
Right. You know, looking back at it, I was like, well, I remember it. It must have been about 7 because it must have been when they did the 5-year anniversary big thing, you know.
TV special
Yeah.
around.
And I had a black and white television, you know, with the rabbit ears, and it was like kind of all snowy, but I remember watching that.
Walk over and smack it.
Yeah. Well, no, you would have to go adjust the rabbit ears.
Oh, the old rabbit ears, yeah.
Yeah, you would put aluminum foil on them. It was crazy. That's what we used to do back then. What do you remember about the moon landing? I mean, we learned a lot this week in researching it.
I've always had a special affinity towards the moon landing. My parents specifically always drove home about how important the date of the moon landing is because July 20th is also my birthday.
Oh, are
so
you serious?
so that day has always been special to me because of how important that was for that time. My parents, you know, when I was really little said, you know, your birthday shares the date. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins landed on the moon.
We'll have to bring him like moon cakes or moon pies. Like that's a good birthday thing for
who?
Andy. For Andy, because his birthday.
Oh, your
Yeah,
birthday's
yeah, I'm
on
waiting.
July 20th?
We
I didn't realize
he wasn't
that.
even paying attention to the conversation. That's how much
No,
he blocked
actually,
that
what
out.
I was doing, I was looking at my phone here. Look, earlier this year, I was down in D.C. I went to the Smithsonian, the
Right.
Air and Space Museum.
Right.
And right there is me touching a piece of the moon.
Were there no lights on in this room?
That's what I'm saying. It's like a dark.
It
it's
says
like a dark
right
picture
there,
with a
touch
circle.
a piece of the moon.
Okay, I don't.
It is
see
very
it.
dark right there. And when
It
you
is
do
very
take a picture
dark.
of it, you get these kind of weird lines and stuff like that.
It's like a black and white round circle with your finger in the middle of it. So we can't tell what that
I was
is.
touching the moon, and look, and there's some other pictures that I have. This is great for a podcast that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Pictures I have
You,
on my
yeah,
phone.
so Ken,
But
have
here's
you
a-
ever worked in radio? You know,
Here's a picture
it's
of
not a
the-
visual medium here.
of the lunar module.
So the spacesuits,
Yes.
when you were down there, the spacesuits to me were an amazing thing that I found out about when we were researching this podcast.
They
And
were
I don't-
almost like a spacecraft in itself.
Right.
The spacesuits.
Well, the funny thing was when they started designing them, it was kind of like the knight in shining armor, like really bulky.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people were moving, it looked like they couldn't even hardly move. So what you may not know is that the first company that got the bid to do the spacesuits was the same company that did women's brasiers and girdles.
Really?
So it was Playtex, which was formerly known as the International Latex Corporation. They won the bid. There were women seamstresses who had been doing bras and girdles for years who ended up making the suits that kept astronauts safe in space.
That's
Can you
I
believe
never
that?
knew that.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating, actually.
Yeah. And
wow.
there was 21 layers to the spacesuit.
21 layers?
They had 21 layers. So when you think about it, during the day it's 100 degrees Celsius, which is 212 degrees Fahrenheit.
Mm-hmm.
And then at night, it gets as cold as minus 173 degrees Celsius or minus 279 degrees Fahrenheit.
The really first test for all this stuff was actually when it was happening. There was
Right.
no way to really test
Not
it
to
beforehand.
truly
to
test
truly
it.
test
They did do testing in Flagstaff, Arizona, just because, like...
which is just a little bit different than the surface of the moon.
It's slightly. You want to hear how different? So here's an example. The Mojave Desert, day to night range is about 20 to 30 degrees on average. So you compare that to 212 degrees during the day and minus 279 degrees at night. So pretty good swing on the moon that
And
you
it also
don't have
doesn't
on the
take
Earth.
into account all the radiation that
Right.
the astronauts would be running into
Right.
being on the moon. So just an amazing.
So what they had to do, because you figure heat is transferred a couple of the ways, is solar radiation. So they had it set up so that these suits were 90% reflective of solar radiation. And then also conduction, heat conduction from a surface. So they also had to have the various materials, knees, waist, elbows, they had foam rubber cushion. But they also had these tubes of water, the plastic tubes of water that were in some of the surface next to the body so that it would help with cooling.
Okay.
And then they had their own like life support system basically so that they could be so that they could leave the module and just walk around the moon.
I mean, it's fascinating. Just
Right.
Again, as we've been putting this show together, just learning all kinds of this different stuff that actually.
It's crazy.
It's amazing we got there.
It's amazing we
Yeah,
got there.
yeah.
And then the other thing, too, is the women that did it. I saw a recent interview with them on CBS Sunday Morning where they were panicked. They're like, please let our stitches hold. Yeah,
Oh, sure.
Because you're responsible for the safety of the astronauts in space.
Yeah.
And I think it's ironic because the very fact that they were in a vacuum in space in those extreme conditions. And they said that some of the things that were breaking down the suits was the fact that the humidity, temperature, light on Earth, so our climate or our weather on Earth, was actually causing them to kind of break down. And
So
to
the
keep-
fact that there is a climate here
Yeah.
has an adverse effect on
Yeah, they were
more
designed
so
for
than being on the moon.
Right.
Yeah.
They were designed for those extremes and the vacuums.
That's crazy.
I know.
You would think that, like, you make a spacesuit on Earth, you're not going to encounter any problems, but
Right.
more problems on Earth than actually in
I know.
space. It's
And then
ridiculous.
to come up with what they had to do, because like when I was looking through like the research of temperatures on the moon and all the thermodynamic equations and like so much beyond my pay grade of what all they were doing to come up with these suits at NASA.
The amount of research and development is just probably staggering among, the teams that they had assembled to come up with these things.
Right. What were your feelings upon like researching the astronauts?
One thing that always jumps out to me is the human element of these kind of stories. And Buzz Aldrin,
Yeah.
the second man, that just fascinated me as I was going through looking up different clips on YouTube. And there's, I think we do have a little bit of sound of Buzz talking about from a 1973 interview, his disappointment of being the second man on the moon.
How disappointed were you that you were the second man on the moon and not the first?
I like to be associated with the fact that I was on the first lunar landing mission instead of being the second man to walk on the moon. But it doesn't bother me particularly. It irritates the heck out of my father, though. He's always looking out for the best things for his offspring.
Can you remember if you were disappointed when the decision was taken, a month or so before you actually went to the moon?
Oh, yeah, certainly disappointed. But I think that my life would have been a little more hectic had I been the first. Who knows, I might even decided to become a college professor the way Neil did.
And you can really hear it in his voice there. I mean, he tries to pass it off as, he was more disappointed for his father because his father wanted him to be the first
And he's
on the
like,
moon.
I'm
But
kind of
really,
disappointed. Yeah.
And I think in the years, since the moon landing, Buzz has always been the one who's really been out in front. He's been, Neil Armstrong was quiet, reserved.
Well, and there was some speculation that they were kind of chosen for those reasons. Buzz Aldrin's kind of like, he didn't mind the limelight, a little bit of a hot dog kind of guy. And I thought it was kind of ironic because in interviews and some of the different stories that I heard about this, I had heard that they kind of wanted Neil Armstrong to do it because for the very reason he would be the first to land on the moon because he was so down to earth. Yeah. Like, how ironic is that? Because his
first man to walk on the moon is really the most down to earth.
So
man.
down to earth. But I thought it was kind of fascinating that they chose him. He had been an aeronautical engineer and a young pilot, and he was shot down in the Korean War. Did you know that?
No,
I did.
I did not know.
You knew that, Andy?
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was shot down in the Korean War, and he ejected and he landed safely. He was like so calm and like cool and collected.
Yeah.
And it really brought him to the center of attention for how he handled that.
Yeah.
And like how it was like a crazy situation.
He had that kind of, early spaceman demeanor to him,
He
with
did.
so many different factors, so many things that are even, out of your control. He managed to keep a level head.
When the Eagle was descending onto the moon, and I believe
yeah.
we do have audio
Yeah.
of this as well from a 2011 interview with Neil Armstrong.
So we continued on toward the landing site, but then the computer showed us where it intended to land, and it was a very bad location. It was on the side of a large crater, about I suppose 100 or 150 meters in diameter, and with very steep slopes covered with very large boulders. Not a good place to land at all. So I took over manually and flew it like a helicopter out to the west direction, and got into a smoother area with not so many rocks, found a level area, and was able to get it down there safely before we ran out of fuel.
Yeah, within what, 20 seconds or 40
Something like
seconds?
20 seconds of fuel left.
I would be freaking out.
Okay,
You're going
I'm like that
crazy.
when we're going on a family vacation. I'm like,
So,
why are
yeah.
you stopping?
Are we going to get to
Are
the
we
next
gonna get
gas
to the next
station? No.
place?
Here you're on the moon.
Right.
You know.
Well, you know what he said about that too is he had said that he kind of calculated it that even if they ran out of fuel, he was close enough and the surface was powdery enough that he knew that, well, we'll still be okay.
Yeah.
Even if we ran out of fuel right before the landing. Well, instead of us talking about it, we may as well bring in our historian here at AccuWeather, meteorologist Evan Myers. He was one of the estimated 600 million people around the world who watched it that day, July 20th, 1969. What do you remember about it, Evan?
So I remember that day pretty vividly. I was 19 years old. My soon-to-be wife, about a year and a half later, she and I and another friend of ours, three of us got in a car and went to northern New Jersey and visited a friend of my wife's who she went to school with. She went to, at the time, went to American University. I believe initially that we were going to watch the moon landing at her friend's house sometime in the late afternoon or early evening.
Yeah, well, the Eagle had landed around 4:17, 4:18.
So I think we were there at the time. So we were going to stay and watch Neil Armstrong come out of the Lunar Module and walk on the moon. But somehow, I don't remember the exact details, but somehow it got delayed. So we were there for a number of hours. And my wife and myself at the time lived in Philadelphia at our respective parents' house. And my wife and I and our friend drove back to my wife's parents' house and watched Neil Armstrong
the small step
set foot on the moon. And I remember us discussing, what did he say? What exactly did he say? I know there's been a debate over time what he said, although he said what he said, and I guess I would trust Neil Armstrong to know what he said.
And actually, he says he came up with that right on the spot. Here is Neil Armstrong back in 2011 in an interview he did with the Certified Practicing Accountants Organization of Australia.
Oh no, I didn't think about that until after landing. I had no confidence in our ability to get down safely yet, so it wasn't. I didn't bother thinking about that until after landing. And
Do you believe that?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah,
I mean,
why not?
sometimes people come out with profound statements, even if they hadn't thought about it. But
The pressure of
I
the
don't know.
moment
You
and
know
he
what?
came up with it?
It
Yeah, it
doesn't
doesn't
matter.
matter.
He said it. He said it.
Do you remember how you felt when you first saw like the first steps coming out with Armstrong? What was going through your mind?
How tired I was from being
Driving all around.
from being driving to New Jersey and back. It in some ways it was almost anticlimactic because we're waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. I mean, you know, when
It
you
was
look,
hours after they had landed.
Yes, when you look back on it, you know, you think, wow, that was incredible. When you're living the moment oftentimes, and this is unfortunate, people have this kind of experience, but when you're in the moment, sometimes you lose, you know, the special nature of what's going on. That's why I always say to people, live in the moment. Think about what's happening. Be mindful of what you're witnessing because oftentimes the mundane takes over.
Let's go back to 7 years before that. Kennedy's speech on September 12th, 1962.
And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it.
How realistic was it to believe in 62 that by the end of the decade, by 1969, that we would actually land a man on the moon?
It was a different age. It was before the age of cynicism, I think. And I remember that, I remember Kennedy, so 62, I was 12. I remember that speech, and I remember him saying something like, we do these things not because they are easy, but because they're hard.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And that's the kind of country we are. And we may have lost our way to a certain extent about how we approach things in this age of cynicism. But I think that when he made that comment, people believed. People believed that we could do that because anything was possible. And as Americans, and just people, not just Americans, but people looking at the cutting edge of things, I think people really believed in it. It's interesting. When President Kennedy was touring Cape Canaveral at the time, before the name was changed, and then changed back, of course. It's Kennedy Space Center, but it's Cape Canaveral. But when he was touring there, sometime after that speech, he was saying hello to different folks working there, and he came across a maintenance person. And he said, "What do you do here?" He said, "I work on the team that's going to help send a man to the moon." And I think there was a national purpose at the time that, unfortunately, I think we've lost.
Evan, you mentioned Cape Canaveral there, and I was just wondering, I was always curious, was there any reason why Cape Canaveral was chosen? Did the weather have anything to do with that?
Well, it was chosen for a couple different reasons. First of all, it was in a remote area. From a flight trajectory standpoint, the kind of flight trajectories that launching the astronauts in orbit around the Earth, remember that's what we did initially, orbits around the Earth, but it was a good place to do the kind of trajectory they were looking at from that launch point. As I said, it was remote. It was somewhat warmer, and of course that would come into play later with the Challenger explosion. We know, and as AccuWeather talked about at the time of the day of the explosion, that was the first and subsequently only launch that took place when temperatures were below freezing, which is highly unusual in that climate in Florida.
Well, it was late January.
It was, but it's still highly unusual, and that's obviously caused a problem with the O-rings with the Challenger with the booster rocket because of the cold temperatures. But there were no cold temperatures back in July, and unlikely to be almost at any time of the year in that area. So that was one of the things. It's really interesting because Jules Verne, the famous science fiction writer from the 1800s, wrote a book about launching people to the moon. And where did he pick for the site of the launch?
Really? Cape
Canaveral. Yep.
Wow.
It's sometimes it's like holding the old flip phone. And those flip phones before the smartphones we have now, what did they resemble? The communicators that were used on Star Trek.
Yep.
So which came first? It's hard to tell. So sometimes fact is stranger than fiction.
It's inspired, maybe.
It is. I'm not sure who inspired who. That's right.
Ideally, what kind of weather is necessary for a good launch?
Well, I think, and I'm not an expert on rocket propulsion, certainly for airplane lift, which is totally a different situation, it can get too hot for good lift. Back in the summer of 1980, for example, when temperatures routinely across places like Oklahoma and Kansas were over 110 degrees, they had to reduce the weight of the planes, less baggage, because the air was thinner. The hotter the air is, the thinner it is. They didn't get the kind of lift they needed, and they sometimes weren't able to take off. But rocket propulsion is a whole different situation. So temperature really isn't that much of an issue unless it's below freezing, and I would suspect that over time they'll solve that issue as well. I think, though, that you want to have non-adverse weather, meaning you don't want to launch in a thunderstorm or a hurricane or anything like that, because, in fact, especially at the beginning of the launch with propulsion just starting, in the first several thousand feet, you don't want to be buffeted by strong adverse winds or crosswinds. So the clearer it is, the calmer it is, I'm sure, is the better for everybody.
So let's go back to the actual launch date, July 16th, 1969. What was the weather like for that day?
I think it was fairly benign. There was no issues, no storms nearby at the time, and so on. And I know that at various times they delayed launches because of thunderstorm activity and so on being close by, delayed it later in the day or the next day or so on. So it was obviously favorable for the launch, and everything, unlike Apollo 13, which was a technical difficulty, but Apollo 11 went off pretty much without a hitch.
One of the things I like to do is kind of look back and ask a what-if kind of a question. A lot of people, kind of, I think, believe that the space race either started in the 50s or possibly with Kennedy's speech in 62, which really wasn't the case. It actually started back in the 30s in World War II.
It's exactly. So it's interesting because rocket propulsion was invented hundreds and hundreds of years before by the Chinese. The Chinese used rockets for decoration and also from a military standpoint. Remember, gunpowder was invented in China, and artillery, guns were used in the Far East way before they ever made it to Europe. Europe was living in the Dark Ages in a lot of different ways, and that way as well. So rockets were used then, but the Germans really worked on rocket propulsion more than just about anyone. In the United States, Dr. Goddard was the person that really spearheaded that, but the rockets that he did were really on a shoestring and were more crude. The rockets the Germans developed, V-1 and V-2 rockets, in fact, near the end of the war, were sent over to, when the Germans ran out of airplanes, they sent rockets to England, devastating parts of London and so on. This is way after the Blitz. The Blitz occurred in 1940. This was way after that. This is near the end of the war. They were just trying to throw the kitchen sink at everybody
just doing
else.
Anything to,
and they were indiscriminate. And so what happened at the end of the war was that there was a race between the Soviets and the Allies to try to gather up these German rocket scientists. And the chief German rocket scientist, Werner von Braun, was captured by the Allies and brought to the United States and was the father of the U.S. space program, even though some people said he was a war criminal for spearheading the German rocket program that devastated parts of England.
And he ends up being the lead rocket engineer during the 50s
and 60s. He was the
60s.
father of the space program during the 50s and 60s. He was the main guy in the U.S. that helped develop the rocket technology that we use. Now, the space program or the space race was started. The Soviets had a head start. They launched the monkey into space. They launched Sputnik, the first satellite. Was the Russians. The Russians launched the first
57.
The first animal in space was a dog, and then the first human in space was Russian, and the dog was a Russian dog. So the Russians were ahead of us in every way, shape, or form. And even today, with no space shuttle program any longer, although talking about reviving and so on, we still send astronauts into space from the Russian Space Center. So we send them into space with Russians. It's the Russians more than any other country in the world now that are doing that. And of course, the Chinese are getting involved in wanting to do that, and some other the Saudis, other countries as well. So it may not be much longer before we have lots of folks back in space from all different countries. And it may not be too much longer before we have other people walking on the face of the moon.
Well, that brings me to my what if, though. Von Braun, if he's captured by the Soviets, do we get to the moon?
So that's the question that goes along with everything in history.
Yes.
The one person, the one man, the one woman impact on history.
Or was our resolve better?
So as individuals, now you really asked a deep philosophical question. Can you go back and change the history? But I think that there's a couple. We as individuals take a great part in painting the picture of how history winds up to be. At the same time, and certainly there are individual leaders, individual scientists, Einstein, for example, Aristotle, people that really have an unbelievable impact on history. But I'll turn your what-if question around. If not that person, it probably would have been another
somebody
person.
Else. Yep.
It would have been somebody else.
Well, I think what you said earlier on, the patriotism after Kennedy's speech, and we were going to get there, there was no stopping us at that point.
There was a resolve. There was a resolve from our scientists, from our science program. There was an infrastructure in the country that aided this kind of development. The National Science Foundation gave tremendous amounts of scholarships out in all the sciences, including meteorology. There was a whole infrastructure in our country that promoted science. We believed in science at that time. I'm not sure some folks believe in science today.
So as we go to July 20th, 1969, the day of the moon landing, Evan, I have to ask you, was that one of the most incredible, if not the most incredible thing you saw of the 1960s?
Well, no, it wasn't.
Really?
As a child of the 60s, well, I grew up as a little kid in the 50s, but in the 60s, was the moon landing, you might look back and say, that was the most incredible, unbelievable thing that ever happened at that time. But there were so many incredible, unbelievable things happening in the United States and across the world with counterculture, civil rights, women's rights, the war in Vietnam, riots, all kinds of things going on. It just seemed to fit in to everything else that was happening. Just another wild and crazy thing that was occurring in the 1960s.
So, Evan, the last time we sent someone to the moon was in 1972. So what do you think? Should we go back to the moon, or should we set our sights on something else like Mars?
Well, I know that there's the Mars is on the horizon, but throughout our human history, the way that we've advanced as a people, as a civilization, as a culture, is to always look beyond the horizon. It's always been to look to something that seems almost unreachable, but yet we're able to reach it. And there's been so many byproducts from looking ahead to those types of almost seemingly unreachable goals that have advanced human history, that advanced humankind, that I think that part of our DNA from the time that the cave dwellers looked at the moon and wondered what it was to finally reaching there. And what are we going to look for next, and how are we going to get there?
Fantastic. I always love having Evan on. Always get into these conversations. And you can check out Evan every day on Weather Insider Podcast, along with AccuWeather's Bernie Rayno. Subscribe today, Apple Podcast, the Google Podcast app, wherever you find your favorite podcast. Evan, thanks so much.
Absolutely.
So it happened. I feel pretty confident that it happened. I mean, I thought it was interesting because after the Apollo landing, that the Flat Earth Society of Europe, I think at the time, said we might have to reconsider things. But Ken, you're like the conspiracy guy, right,
do.
Andy?
I
right?
do love my conspiracy
He loves it.
theories.
He has something about the Detroit
I
airport.
really don't want to encourage this.
Or no, it's the Denver airport.
The Denver airport.
Oh,
there is
gosh.
you don't want to know
We could do a
what's going
whole
on
another
underneath the
show
Denver
about
airport.
that.
So you and Seth Curry, right?
Well, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
this is what
you're going to try to justify this now?
No. I actually believe we went to the moon. I'm all
Oh,
on board on
good.
this.
Thank
I'm not a
goodness.
conspiracy
Okay.
theorist on this one. But, I mean, polls are done on this. About 5% of people out there actually believe that we didn't go to the moon. And it was all really, this was all this kind of controversy was kicked up last December with Steph Curry, NBA superstar. He was on the Winging It podcast, and he said he didn't believe that Americans landed on the moon. Here's a little bit of that.
We ever been to the moon? Nope. They gonna come get us. I don't think so either. Sorry, I don't want to start a conspiracy. They ain't been on the moon.
You don't think so?
Mm-mm.
Now, Kerry later admitted that, he was just joking around.
Do you think he was? Do you think he was joking, or do you think he was trying to save face?
We do a podcast all the time. You know some of the stuff that we say. Sometimes we just...
you're joking.
You're joking around. You're around your friends, and you just start saying stuff. So I think really he was probably just joking around. But it did cause up quite a controversy, you know.
Right.
And
Well, because there's the people that don't believe it.
well,
and they're like,
there's actually
hey, Steph
astronauts
Curry
who walked on the moon. Now, we're not just talking about Apollo 11 here. I mean, we've been to the moon several times, so there's plenty of astronauts who have actually walked on the moon, and they invited Steph Curry, you know, to down to Houston and take a tour of the facilities and stuff like that. But
it's hard for us as a nation to come together on anything, let alone a huge conspiracy that involves thousands of people.
So wait a minute. All you have to say is you don't believe we actually landed on the moon, and you get a free trip to NASA to check it out. Because I'm all for it.
Well, if you're one of the best basketball players in the world,
I am.
Absolutely,
I am.
Andy, like they're going to send.
You can't even make a shot into a trash can here in the studio, so I doubt.
Look, all I'm saying is I want to go to
NASA.
NASA. Okay.
Maybe after this episode we'll get invited.
Yeah, so maybe after this episode, if that's what it takes. But, I thought it was interesting that one of the pilots, Charles Duke of Apollo 16, the Lunar Module there, he said, we've been to the moon 9 times. I mean, why did we fake it 9 times if we faked it?
It's a very good point. And, after the Steph Curry controversy came around, Forbes magazine did an article. And since this is an AccuWeather podcast, we should probably talk a little bit about the weather. Mm-hmm. The lack of weather on the moon actually proves we've been to the moon.
Yes, I know. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, because from this article, they say, here on Earth, footprints generally don't last very long. Whenever you leave tracks, you fully expect that whether it takes minutes, days, or weeks, eventually a natural phenomenon in the world will actually cover them up. So there's no weather, there's no wind.
Right, there's
no
nothing
rain.
in space that's going to wash away a footprint.
No.
You're not going to ever have that happen.
And there's been spacecrafts that have gone by and have mapped out the moon, and you can still see the footprints.
So we've been there.
Yeah. So it proves that we've been there, and like you said, several times we've been there. So it's just amazing. The lack of weather on the moon is what actually proves that we've been there.
Actually proves it. And Alan Bean, he was from Apollo 12. He said, since that time, I have not complained about the weather one single time. He was like, I'm glad there's weather. And he said, we're lucky to be here. Final thoughts, you guys. The whole thing is fascinating, and there are so many different facets of the moon landing that I didn't even know about.
Final thought from me is that, of course, there's a lot of talk about going back to the moon. And, what we just talked about was the footprints still there on the moon. Mm-hmm. There is nothing that protects that. So if Japan goes to the moon,
right,
or China goes to the moon, they can land in the same spot and erase Neil Armstrong's footprints.
Well, then are we going to have to go back just because we can keep putting footprints?
Well, that's what, and there was a great article in the New York Times this weekend talking about this. And should there be something that protects that? And how do you do that?
Oh, my gosh. You mean like go up and set like some kind of dome?
Well, I mean, I don't know if we have to go up and protect it that way, but is there an agreement here between the countries of Earth?
Oh, that's kind of tough. We can't agree on things pertaining to the Earth now.
But the thought that, we can send Andy up there and he can just ruin the footprints of Neil Armstrong. I'm
not going to ruin the footprints.
You're the moon baby.
Baby. But, the one thing that I thought was really interesting about it is I read a lot of quotes from different astronauts who have been there, and perspective really helps you to appreciate your world, because what I noticed about it was not so much the moon. That sounds terrible, but I wasn't all that interested in the moon. I was interested in the Earth. It was amazing to see weather and how beautiful the Earth was and how bright it was, and to think we just need to come together and get along. I mean, we're all one human race.
Good luck with that.
When you see it, I know it's crazy. That's what I mean. It really must give you such perspective when you see it from out there.
My final thought in terms of how important this is, I really think that, for the last several decades and even now, I think that we should be doing more of this. We should be exploring space more. We should be doing more with the moon. We should be...
Would you rather us go to the moon again or
another planet?
Focus on Mars?
Why can't you focus on both, right?
Well, it's very expensive.
It is pretty expensive, so you got to pick and choose, Andy. You can't have it all.
I don't know, but I don't have an answer for that. But what I do think is that, we should be making more conscious efforts to explore more that's outside of the world that we know.
Yeah, I agree. And, it was funny because we did the space race, and then 1972 was the last guy that we sent. And then we're like, okay, we won. I'm going to get drinks.
The past couple of weeks, there's been a number of great documentaries on, like, the Science Channel, Nat Geo. Even the one that happened in November of '69, our second trip to the moon, there was very little fanfare around that whatsoever. It was like, oh, we're going back there again. Why don't we focus on the problems that we have here on Earth? Maybe instead of spending all this money to go to the moon. And
because there was a bunch of unemployment at that time.
Exactly.
The economy was kind of tanking, and then all of a sudden people turned.
So it was just amazing to do this
We're
great,
so
gigantic
short-sighted.
feat. And then, just months later, it was like, all right, well, forget about that.
I know. It's like, okay, we beat the Russians. Yay. Yeah. Time to go take a rest for a while until we decide to race again. But, like I said, I think it's all about perspective. And one of the quotes that really impacted me was from space, one of the astronauts in the Nat Geo documentary, Apollo Mission to the Moon. Take a listen to this.
Through all time, the moon has endured out there, pale and distant, determining the tides, tugging of the heart, a symbol, a beacon, a goal.
As we departed from the Earth on our way to the moon, I was particularly impressed by the relative insignificance of this planet that we live on. We all tend to think that it's a mammoth place, that it goes on forever. And here is this one very small, colorful body against this black backdrop that goes on forever. I think that it impressed me with the thought that man should strive very hard to learn to live with his brothers and learn how to take care of this very small and fragile planet that he lives on.